Welcome to Revelation TV Presents as we mark the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. In the previous programme, we discussed how the war started and the general conditions of facing British soldiers in the trenches. And in this programme, we'll be marking the end of the First World War and reflecting upon the lives that were lost and sacrificed on behalf of our nation. And I'm joined by retired Lieutenant Colonel Dennis Vincent, and also retired Major Rhett Parkinson, who is the director of the Armed Forces Christian Union. Hello, so welcome back to this second part of the programme we're doing to mark the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. Dennis, I'll start off with you. What was conditions like for the British soldiers in the trenches? What would a day in the life of a British soldier on the Western Front look like?
Yes, thanks, Simon. So if you can imagine, by 1914, these huge trenches, they're zigzagging across Europe. And if you can think of standing in a 7-foot ditch on a wet, cold day, that's what we're looking at. But they had a daily routine to their activity. And for a lot of the time, this could be quite boring, with moments of fear punctuating it. They would get up an hour before dawn to what's known stand to, which is being ready should they be attacked, because there was always this fear that they would be attacked at dawn. After that, and as obvious attack wouldn't happen, they'd then get into a series of cooking breakfast, cleaning their rifles, cleaning their equipment. And throughout the day, they would do chores in the trenches and go on sentry duties, ready to stand to again as last light approached. At night time is when things got a bit scary for them, because they could either go into no man's land on patrols or go into no man's land to do working parties, fixing the wire or laying mines. And this routine would go on. Now, the British had a good system of rotating their troops through the front line, however. So a soldier would only spend 15% of his time actually in the front line under those conditions. 40% of their time would be spent in the support trenches, and 45% of their time would be spent behind the trenches in billets where they could train and rest and recuperate. And that's different to the other armies that tend to leave their soldiers there longer.
And Rhett, we know the extraordinary high number of casualties involved during the First World War, particularly on the Western Front in particular. Now, what were conditions like facing Christians? Was it because of the threat of loss of life and the ever-present threat of death? Did many come to the Lord during that time?
Well, I think it's difficult to sort of throw back to that or think back to that period, because the culture was quite different. We'd come out of that Victorian, sort of very strong evangelical period through the 1800s, where the vast majority of people had come into were in that routine of going to church on Sunday. The vicars were honoured in society. Society was clearly arguably much more structured, I guess, in terms of the wealthy, the haves and the have-nots, a smaller middle class. So. But it was a largely religious society in a way that I think we've moved a long way away from now. We're very much in a secular society. That said, I think when you are, from experience, when you're on operations, all the trappings of everyday life, how the wife is doing, or how, what's happening at home with your parents and so on, or your concerns about, mortgages and earning money and all that sort of stuff is taken away. The army feeds you, it clothes you, it tells you what to do. So it's very structured, and life becomes quite focused. It becomes about your mates. It becomes about the everyday. And because of the threat of death, I think that idea of our mortality is much more front and centre. And people do definitely turn to look for something outside of themselves. So the opportunities to witness on operations, and I imagine it was much the same 100 years ago in the trenches. Every soldier, I meant to bring one with me, but every soldier was given a St. John's Gospel with a inscription in the front of it by General Haig. about the importance of reading it, and in the back of it were a few hymns. They pointed obviously to Jesus, and you had time and space to think about an environment which you couldn't guarantee that you're going to be alive tomorrow, particularly if you're coming up to big operations, big offensives. So yeah, faith became, I think, much more important. And alongside that, we had a tradition from before of chaplains. We called them padres, going back to the fighting in the peninsula under Wellington's day, which we still have in the modern Navy, Army, Air Force. And they were there for the spiritual welfare and the general welfare of their soldiers. And so that was there as well.
Dennis, anything you'd like to add on the nature of the British soldier and facing that almost daily threat of death in particular would have made people really think about life and the meaning of life?
I do. I just pick up on the last point about padres because it's a very interesting development you see in the First World War. In 1914, the British padre, as Rhett said, is a venerated person, and they're working at the headquarters level. Normally at brigade level, so the troops are not seeing them. But the padres realised, that the Church of England at the time realised it must move with the times. And they recruit thousands of padres into the front line. And padres get into the front line, there's one per battalion, they go forward with the soldiers, and they set a Christ-like example for people. They go out under fire with no weapons to retrieve the wounded. And they do start to really bring people to faith. There's a famous one called Woodbine Willie that you may have heard of, who always had cigarettes for the soldiers in his pocket and would give them cigarettes and just talk about faith with them. But there is that focus when you're in combat about your mortality and the need for something bigger, which as a Christian you can comfort people with that need. It's the famous saying, "There's no atheist in a foxhole," is true. And we've seen that in recent conflicts of far more people coming to faith in Afghanistan because they're faced with that the realities of life and death.
Incredible. Rhett, can you show us this very special Bible that you have here and just hold it up for our viewers, unless you want me to do it? You can see that now. I show this one. So this one is a battle-scarred Bible there, if you can see that on the screens there. It's incredible, over 100 years old. Can you share us the story behind this Bible?
Yeah, so it belonged to a chap who finished life as a lieutenant general, 3-star general, Sir Arthur Smith. He was born in 1890 and was serving in the early part of the First World War. His father gave it to him, and inscribed on the cover leaf is Psalm 91, which even today is known as the soldier's psalm, obviously for praying for protection. And he was injured actually a number of times throughout the war, but 3 times in the first year. And one of the times he had this in his pocket, and a German shell, the shrapnel from the shell, entered the Bible and probably saved his life, certainly physically. He went on to have a very prestigious career both in the military and then afterwards heading up Evangelical Alliance and various other things. And we still use material that he wrote back in the 1920s, a 100-day Bible study, which is very in-depth. About his knowledge about the Bible was phenomenal. So he was obviously an exceptional man who faith was front and centre all the way through his life.
Excellent. And Dennis, can you explain to us, which seems a big contradiction, that the final year of the war, 1918, marked the biggest number of casualties and fatalities. Why was that the case?
Yes, well, it's often overlooked, the 1918 campaign. It starts off in March with what's known as the Kaiser's Offensive. The Russians had collapsed, and the Germans found themselves with far more troops that they could deploy on the Western Front. And they develop a stormtrooper tactic, which is small groups of men moving across no man's land. And the Allies are caught wanting. They'd been in trenches for 3 years. There was that static mentality. And the Germans advance up to 60 miles in places. Actually, my great-uncle was killed 2 days after that offensive in the Arras area. But the Allies reel back. They hold the line just, and the Germans basically run out of steam. The blockades are taking effect. They can't support the advance, and the British Army leads what's known as the 100-day offensive, which is the British Army at its best then, using its tanks, its aircraft, it's the tactics they've developed over the 4 years. And it's in those 100 days, the Germans realise that they cannot win the war and sue for the armistice. But you're right, 2 million men killed in that and injured in that fighting.
Let's have a look now at some original archive footage dating back to 1918.
1918. Nearly 4 years of bitter fighting climax in a thunderous German attack. Defeat stares the British and French in the face. Then halfway through this year, the Allies strike back. The stalemate of the trenches is suddenly over. The guns fall silent.
We all stopped, looked at one another, because we suddenly realised that we had no objective, nothing whatever to look forward to do.
Yet for the Allies, 1918 is the costliest year of the war. After the slaughter, it brings hope that millions did not die in vain.
We went mad. The gates was open, everybody went ashore. We was dancing in the streets with the wounded soldiers and the girls.
This is the story of the year that changed everything, seen now for the first time in colour.
Rhett, what do you think the turning point was in 19? Was it the fact that the Germans themselves were running out of steam to actually fight, with the blockade on German naval ships and the population starving? The fact that they couldn't fight anymore? Was it the introduction of the Americans really into the First World War, combined with the use of technology such as aircraft and tanks that really culminated in the end of the First World War as we approached like August, September of 1918?
I think that's a very good question. I think all of those apply in the physical realm. I'm interested that in November 1917, King George V, as the head of the church, head of state in the UK, called for a national day of prayer. It only happened once in the First World War, happened half a dozen times in the Second World War. But on the 6th of January 1918, people up and down the country went to church and prayed for the nation and for an end to the slaughter, end to this what seemed to be endless and devastating conflict. And also on the 4th of August, annually from 1915, 16, 17, 18, on the anniversary of the outbreak of war, there had been a tradition that people were going to church and praying in church for God's intervention, for God to do something. And I think I'm right in saying, I'll turn to Dennis as the historian or the academic, but so that was the 4th of August 1918, they did that again, and it was the 8th of August, the 100-day, 6th or 8th of August, so a couple of days later, that the Allied offensive started and really didn't lose a significant battle for the next 100 days. It's not quite 100 days, but it's known as the 100-day offensive. So yeah, physically there are all sorts of reasons. I think the blockade, it was total war. The Germans had just run out of steam. The Americans were coming in. We had more resources. The empire was up and running by 1918 fully. But I wonder spiritually what was happening in that in that realm in terms of breaking something through that prayer.
Absolutely. And Dennis, when we think of the First World War, we did this in the first programme, we think of Passchendaele, we think of the Battle of the Somme. But there were other theatres of war, wasn't there, that took place in this war, particularly in the Middle East, such as the war in the Holy Land to liberate the Holy Land from the Ottoman Turks, the Battle of Gallipoli. Were also these very significant to ending the First World War?
Yes, no, exactly. It's often forgotten this was a global conflict, and you're right. There's a fixation, especially in Britain, on the Western Front. I think because so many of the British Army served there, and it's quite close. So people could go and visit the sites after, see where their loved ones died. But around the world, you have these other conflicts. They're mainly fought by the Empire. And so they reduce in importance in the British psyche, but they're ongoing, as you say. There are conflicts in Africa which last throughout the whole of the war as the Germans defend their colonies there. And obviously when Turkey enters a war, there are those two conflicts that you mentioned, the Gallipoli fight in 1915 where the British try to unblock the Bosporus, but the much longer campaign which goes on through Iraq and into Jordan and eventually up to capture Jerusalem. And this brings about the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, that was allied to the German and Austrian-Hungarian Empire. We mentioned in the first programme also the campaign in Italy against the Austrians, which the British are involved in too.
Let's have a look now at some original archive footage that marked the end of the First World War.
Most of Germany's food supply. Its ships were stuck in port. People were starving. In the field, rations were diminishing by the day. Despite General Ludendorff's determination to fight on, other German commanders knew the game was up.
The morale of the troops has suffered seriously, and their power of resisting diminishes daily. They surrender in hordes whenever the enemy attacks. I do not believe there is any possibility of holding out over December. Ludendorff does not realize the whole seriousness of the situation. Whatever happens, we must obtain peace before the enemy breaks through into Germany. If he does, woe on us.
As Germany fought pointlessly on, for the Allies' exhausted soldiers, it seemed a more wasteful war than ever.
How I wish the Hun would chuck it before we lose thousands more valuable lives. I can imagine the man in the trench being very disinclined to pop the parapet, with peace so close at hand. Oh, I am weary of this war.
The casualties reported today are 253 officers and 6,000 men. Our casualties for many weeks past have been enormous. They must have averaged 30 to 40,000 per week. The hospitals are full to overflowing. One volunteer orderly told me that some of the cases sent over were so bad that they were actually packed up in boxes.
I think it is safe to say that it cannot be much longer. The Huns we met were certainly nothing to fear, and could think of nothing but peace.
French and Belgian refugees returned to villages and towns which had been occupied by the German army and ruined by war. By early November, most German soldiers could clearly see the ruin within their own ranks.
The German armies were in very bad shape. Every soldier and civilian was hungry. Losses in material could not be replaced, and the soldiers arriving at the front were too young, poorly trained and often unwilling to risk their necks because the war looked like a lost cause.
Ludendorff still wanted to fight and called on German troops to reject all proposals for peace. But then came sudden collapse. On October the 26th, the Kaiser sacked Ludendorff for insubordination. 2 weeks later, the Kaiser himself abdicated and went into exile. The German politicians left behind knew they had to submit to Allied terms. At 5 o'clock on the morning of November the 11th, an armistice was signed on a train in the French forest of Compiègne. At 11 o'clock, on the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns of the Western Front fell silent.
Everything stopped, and there was what I can only call as a deadly hush over everything. And we all stopped, looked at one another, because we suddenly realised that we had no objective, nothing whatever to look forward to do. Nothing to do. It was a very eerie feeling.
You have won the greatest battle in history and rescued the most sacred of all causes, the liberty of the world. You have full right to be proud, for you have crowned your standards with immortal glory and won the gratitude of posterity.
Dennis, as we come to the end of this programme, what do you think the military lessons have been learned from the First World War?
Well, different armies take away different lessons, and it tends to be the losers that take away more important lessons. The British learn that you need to mechanise, and they start to look into that, but the imperial policing and cost drives them not to do as much as they would have wanted to. The French take away the lesson that the power of defence is everything, and they want to defend their northern industrialist area, so they build the Maginot Line to keep out any further German aggression. The Russians take away the need for mass armour, and they develop a new armoured system. The Germans are held to a small army by the Treaty of Versailles, but they understand the power of manoeuvre, as they saw in 1918. And they also invest in their junior commanders and start this idea of initiative at the lower levels, which comes into play later. Interestingly, the Australians, the Canadians, New Zealanders, their armies really start the catalyst of their nations, and they come back with a new pride in their nation. The Americans enter the war quite late, but they take away this idea that diplomacy must always come first before force. And so you get the driving force of the League of Nations coming from them.
And we have to ask you, Rhett, about the loss of officers, because during the First World War, the number of officers, fatalities was huge, wasn't it? And
yeah, well, it was interesting. The officer corps was drawn from the wealthy, the elite. They were the ones who were educated and naturally took that leadership role. They were the ones who had the potential. And because they were the ones who led from the front, particularly amongst junior officers, they would be the first over the top of the trench. They were the ones who were trying to rouse the troops when they were hunkered down in shell holes and any attack had lost its momentum. And so the casualty rate amongst them is much higher, significantly, proportionally higher amongst officers, even though there are far fewer officers. Proportionally, they lost, as a percentage, a much higher casualty.
Yeah. And Dennis, how will you be remembering the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War, obviously known as the Great War?
Yeah, I do a lot with the military, but actually on that day, on the 11th, when it falls on the day this year, I'll be with my scout troop, and I've talked to my scouts about the importance of this, how important it is to remember the sacrifice, and we'll be at a big parade at Sandhurst to mark the 100th anniversary.
Excellent. And Rhett, why is it so important and so significant that 100 years on that we remember and honour the sacrifice that was made by British servicemen in defending these islands from German imperialism?
I think, we owe our modern society the freedom to choose, the freedom to free press, freedom of speech and all of those things to those men and women, not just who lost their lives and were injured, both physically and many more probably mentally in the First World War, but actually every generation since. And we've lost people every year, except I think 1969 is the only year the British Army has not lost someone on operations. And even today, we have people out who are defending our privileges of our democracy, our society, by putting their lives on the line. And it's for that reason, I think, both past and present, that what we're doing, what you're doing today through the programme is so important.
And Dennis, how can our viewers support Christians serving in our armed forces today, and how vital is that support?
That support is absolutely vital, and Rhett's organisation goes a long way to doing that. They have a prayer support network, and that's the key, really. When I was on operations, I knew that there were people praying for me every day for my safe return and for my actions. And I think if people could do that, could pray for the armed forces, or maybe get in touch with Rhett and pray for an individual soldier or airman, that would be really useful.
Okay. Gentlemen, I thank you so much for joining me for this special programme to mark the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War. I want to thank you all for watching these two very special programmes to mark the end of the First World War as we mark its 100th anniversary. And this is time that we should reflect and pray for armed forces, but also to remember the great sacrifice made by armed forces during the First World War, in which we saw an incredible number of casualties to protect our freedom, our democracy and our Christian faith. So thank you for watching this special series of programmes to mark the 100th anniversary of the end of the First World War.